Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining our program today. And today's topic for the webcast is the advisory paradox and how can we help consulting clients confront problems when they would rather look away. I know that's a mouthful, but I appreciate you all being here today. Before we dive into the topic, let me invite you to post any questions that you have using the Q&A button. The chat's going to be disabled, but the Q&A button's there for you to put questions in, and I really much appreciate your questions. So let's get on with it. So many consultants and advisors and business coaches are serving business owners who seems to resist the notion that there might be significant issues in their company or that the issues they don't know about are something they don't need to be concerned about. I like to call it maybe the ostrich head in the sand syndrome. So I encountered that many times in my years advising lower middle market businesses. And recently I got to thinking, as advisors to these people, why do we see this so often? And how might we best kind of navigate through a discussion to open their minds to the possibility there's hidden issues they need to be aware of? And since this deals with the mindset of our business owner clients, I thought this would be an amazing topic to address with my good friend, Dr. Larry Gard. So I invited Larry to share his insights with us today. So let me bring Larry into the meeting. Hey, Larry, thanks for joining me today.
Good morning, Tom, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, would you just spend a couple minutes giving our audience an idea of your background and where you are in your career journey?
Sure. Well, I was a psychologist in private practice for many years, and then I also did some consulting to businesses, doing executive coaching and pre-hire assessments. But my original training focused on older adults, and in 2017, I published a book called Done with Work, A Dozen Perspectives on the Decision to Retire. And it was based on interviews I did with people who made that leap. And since then, I started Done with Work Retirement Coaching and Consulting. I work with late career professionals and business owners to help them plan for that next chapter. And this year, I started that transition myself. I put my psychology license on hold. I can't call myself a psychologist anymore, but it does allow me to concentrate on the retirement coaching.
That's great. Thanks, Larry. Now to the question of the day. So why might business owners be resistant to that idea there are critical business issues in their company that they're unaware of? I was thinking that maybe one possible explanation is these people are so busy dealing with what they're currently dealing with in their company, and that they're concerned that piling on more issues would just overwhelm them. And that might be true. But in my experience, the things that they're busy working on are typically less critical or impactful than some of the things that are currently hidden from view. So what are your thoughts, Larry? What do you think?
I think what you say is very likely, Tom, and it's certainly consistent with research on thinking errors. We're bombarded with so much more information than we could possibly process, business owners included. And so it's natural for our brains to turn to shortcuts, call those shortcuts heuristics. Let me share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that.
I can see it.
So heuristics are basically quick rules of thumb. They're like an educated guess that helps us find a solution faster. And while they can save us time, there's no guarantee that they'll be accurate. And because of that, it can cause us to make mistakes in our personal and professional lives. So for example, the availability heuristic is a mental shortcut that we frequently use when we're making judgments. The more easily and readily that something comes to mind, the more it influences our decision. So if you imagine that you're a business owner and say in the past year, 2 of your really close friends had lousy experiences selling their companies to a private equity firm. So at that point, how objective are you going to be if your advisor comes in and recommends that you do the same? Will you even think about the private equity sales that do go smoothly, or will your friend's situation be top of mind? So another example would be the familiarity heuristic. We use our past experiences as a guide, and we tend to favor thinking strategies that served us well in the past. So a business owner is naturally going to gravitate to their established way of looking at things, especially, again, if you come in as an advisor proposing an unfamiliar framework or concept.
Yeah, I've seen that happen many times and in my own practice. And I I might be sharing a new way to think about things, maybe a new methodology or a new concept, but they're probably convinced that their own way is fine. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. It's familiar to us, but it takes them time and mental energy to hear you out, think carefully about what you've said, and it's just so much easier for them to stick with what's familiar. So this brings me to what we call cognitive biases. These are the systemic thinking errors that occur when we rely on heuristics. For example, another heuristic is our tendency to default toward the positive. People see what they hope to see, they see what they expect to see, even if it's incorrect. Bring up the next slide there. So, we tend to pay attention to positive information. We tend to make optimistic predictions. We tend not to notice things that cause us emotional discomfort. And the end result of that is a cognitive bias we call selective perception. I came across a couple interesting pieces of data that demonstrate that. One study found that almost half of US adults don't know the annual interest rate on their credit cards. And another study found that 20% of people who had enrolled in a weight loss program never weighed themselves before. I have to admit, I haven't set foot on my scale since Thanksgiving either. But selective perception helps us stay focused, but it can prevent us from being open to information that we ought to consider, including sage advice from a consultant.
I think it might be helpful if you can give us maybe one or two examples. I think that'll help us to digest this a little bit.
Sure. I hear examples all the time from my colleagues who do valuation work. And one of them told me about a business owner who had spent years developing proprietary software for his management team. And he was convinced that it made his company much more attractive to a prospective buyer because it helped him optimize his operations. But the evaluation advisor had to point out, that software was based on old technology, newer off-the-shelf products. They were faster, they were more robust and compatible with other systems, and just as customizable. So this owner was so focused on how much that software made his life easier that he wasn't thinking about how it might be working against him. I think most of us have fallen victim to selective perception, and we recognize that there have to be safeguards. Now, for example, if you're in the real estate market, it's quite easy to fall in love with a house and kind of dismiss the reservations we might have about that property. And that's why it's standard practice to arrange for a thorough and objective inspection before you purchase a home.
If I'm a consultant and I'm trying to help a client recognize and attend to a significant problem in their business, is there any way we can help them to overcome that selective perception?
One of my mentors early on said to me, you can't push a rope. It's very true in therapy circles. I think if you point out a problem directly to a client before you've developed a rapport, you run the risk of making them feel defensive. I think if it's possible, it's more effective if you can work side by side with your client using whatever your preferred assessment tool is, so that the two of you actually uncover the problems together, in much the same way that a home inspector might invite the buyer to come along with them for the inspection. Certainly asking open-ended questions can help you get at what your client's positive beliefs and assumptions are. For example, you could play devil's advocate and say, what market forces could negatively affect your projections? Also keep in mind that selective perception can cause your clients to be unrealistic. So, it might be helpful for you to point out to them that, objective planning could offer them a competitive advantage. Also, as you're going through your analysis, you can try offering a best case, expected case, and worst case scenario. I've also said to both my patients and my clients, part of my job is to help you look at your situation from every angle. And I'm glad that you're feeling good about X, but if we don't consider Y, then we've not been truly thorough, have we?
Larry, are there other kinds of cognitive biases that business owners should be alert to?
Absolutely. related to selective perception is the salience bias. That's our tendency to focus on data that's most visible while ignoring important information that could result in a more reasoned and reasonable judgment. So for example, your clients could be focused on sales numbers that are right in front of them and be ignoring other data like customer returns that could be telling a very different story about the health of their company. One strategy you can use to overcome this bias is to raise relevant questions that can't be answered using the data that your client's currently relying on. So for example, to the extent that your questions are provoking, thought-provoking rather, chances are your clients are going to be more open. So, for example, if you think that they ought to be looking at historical data, you could ask, how has your firm performed across multiple market cycles? In some cases, usually around hiring or promotions, I've developed checklists or weighted scoring systems for clients, and that also helps them make a more informed decision that brings in more objective data. And let's see, next slide here. Another bias is the status quo bias. That's our preference for maintaining the existing state of affairs. And studies show that consumers opt to stay with their same provider, vendor, or supplier, even if they're offered an alternative that's more reliable or affordable. This comes from our desire to minimize risk, which is why you want to share how you've helped others so that your prospect can envision themselves benefiting. You might also find it helpful to talk about their goals. Is it realistic for them to even reach those if they keep things the same? Also, keep in mind that the status quo bias often emerges when clients are feeling overwhelmed. So if you can, if it's feasible, you might want to think about offering an incremental approach or a low-risk trial intervention. Now, I've often said to undecided clients, how about if we agree to meet for 3 sessions or so, and then we'll see how we feel it's going. And one other point on this one, Tom, research suggests that people prefer options that permit further choice as opposed to options that don't. So if you're trying to convince a client to work with you, an incremental approach that includes subsequent options for how that project gets structured as you continue down the road, that might resonate with them. Next slide here. Now, closely related to the status quo bias is the conservatism bias. And that's a tendency for people to cling to their prior beliefs or initial assessments, even when you present them with new evidence that challenges those views.
Larry, I've heard of something called confirmation bias before. Is that the same thing?
They're very similar, Tom, and they can occur in tandem, overlap. The conservatism bias that we're talking about here, that's about being resistant to change, while the confirmation bias, which many of us have heard of, that's about selectively seeking out and attending to information that supports our existing beliefs. Now, a frontal assault, probably not going to get you very far with this, but think about whether or not you can show your clients how your approach can be integrated with their existing beliefs or framework. But for example, I have a friend who's very likable, very extroverted, a real people person who he built his company and his clientele through very skilled, genuine in-person contact, totally relationship based. And many years ago, he was approached by a marketing firm that offered to help promote his company on LinkedIn. And he was dead set against it. He thought social media is just nonsense, until they suggested that maybe his content could involve interviews and collaborations with his clients. One other strategy to consider when you're trying to counter this bias, research is pretty consistently shows that people tend to be more sensitive to losses rather than to gains. So if you're presenting to clients, consider framing your appeal to them in terms of gains and losses, and really try and emphasize how you can prevent the latter.
Larry, another possible scenario I thought of is these people just don't have any appetite for hearing bad news. Still, they might go to a dentist, on an annual basis to get their teeth checked or to the family doctor for an annual physical. In those cases, they are proactively looking to uncover problems that they might nip in the bud to preserve their health. So as a consultant in the past, I ran business wellness workshops using EvaluSys, and I even wore a doctor's coat and I put a stethoscope around my neck as a prop. And we would hope these business owners would recognize a similar rationale for the health of their business.
Well, you'd think they could, Tom. But if people were fully rational, I wouldn't be in business. But going back to your analogy, there are also plenty of people who put off seeing a doctor or a dentist because they don't want to be diagnosed with anything. And we like to think of ourselves as solid, competent, smart. And we'd rather not think anything negative about ourselves. So any sort of diagnostic assessment or process that we offer does have the potential to be threatening to our clients. Again, once you have some rapport with them, you might be able to lessen the impact of this by asking them, do you see yourself as somebody who likes to know about a potential issue ahead of time, or do you prefer to not know?
Yeah, this is great, Larry. These issues tie back to our original discussions years ago. I know you remember them. Why business owners don't do exit planning. Do you remember that?
Well, that's advisors, that was our common interest, Tom.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
If advisors are to serve the long-term best interests of their clients, they need to be able to break through those walls that those clients put up.
Speaking of those walls, there's a saying among psychotherapists: everybody wants their life to be different, but no one wants to change. Advisors face a very similar challenge. They seek you out because they want a thriving business. But accomplishing that typically requires things like planning, targeted changes, persistence, and human nature creates roadblocks to that. There are other similarities. Like therapists, advisors, they have to establish rapport. You've got to meet the client where they're at, which means not pushing the process too quickly or in an unwanted direction. You have to listen, not just for the meaning behind what clients tell you, but also for what they're not saying. And you've got to ask questions in a way that doesn't put them on guard. Tom, you've heard me talk about this before. In my first year of grad school, I was taught not to ask patients questions that started with the word why, because doing that tends to put people on the defensive. It pulls for an explanation rather than a broader explanation of the topic. It's better to say, tell me about X, or what led up to Y. The Decision Lab, which is a consulting firm, I believe, out of Canada that, Tom, you introduced me to, they specialize in minimizing cognitive bias. And on their website, their founders wrote a quote I'd like to share. Most of us strongly prefer to follow our gut, even if its forecasts have been wrong in the past. Well, Tom, I think the same is true for many of our clients, perhaps ironically, as they become more experienced. Here, too, I think advisors can get more mileage by respecting this rather than rejecting it outright. If I've got a client who wants to make decisions based on their gut, I'll say to them, well, the gut isn't really an organ of intelligence, but we can certainly include it in our analysis. But that said, there's nothing wrong with making sure that your gut has a full array of information. So let's get some additional data here. Let me bring up one more slide here. Now, sometimes your clients may insist on following their gut. You might also want to try pointing out these potential downsides. Now, relying exclusively on your gut can lead people to feel overconfident. And I see this all the time with owners who are making personnel decisions. I'll often counter it by saying, I know you're really sure about this candidate, but would it be unreasonable to give them a stretch assignment or do some psych testing first? Number two, our emotions can influence our gut during periods of stress or uncertainty. And let's face it, as advisors, that's often when we're brought in. You could say something along the lines of, hey, I know it's tempting to trust your gut right now, but your emotions could understandably be at play too. So let's talk about how we can get some more clarity. And number three, relying on our gut can sometimes be okay in a familiar circumstance, but it can be misleading in a complex or novel situation. So you might say, I don't mean to doubt your intuition, especially given your experience, but is anyone's intuition really built for something like this? How about we make sure we haven't overlooked anything before we proceed?
I wonder if another reason why clients might resist the efforts of consultants is because maybe they view the consultant as too low of priority. Maybe the consultant might not have fully earned the client's respect as being a font of wisdom and insight. And so the client might be discounting his or her advice. Does that fit with what we discussed?
It's possible, Tom, that sounds like a nuanced example of cognitive bias. I mean, the client may be slow to value the consultant precisely because the cognitive bias prevents them from fully appreciating what the consultant's telling them. They're not really rejecting the consultant outright, but they don't respect them yet either.
Yeah, it's not easy to tease those things apart. So I'm reminded of the evaluation you designed for me at EvaluSys a few years back, the engagement readiness assessment. Are any of those biases we've talked about today reflected in that diagnostic tool?
Good point, Tom. Yeah, that assessment helps advisors gauge clients' readiness to embark on initiatives like strategic planning, exit planning, or other significant projects. And it looks at 8 factors that could influence the advisory relationship and the client's success. And there are 2 factors that we've talked about today that are that the assessment looks at. One would be attitude toward change. Does the client embrace change or do they find it uncomfortable? And that reflects the status quo bias that we talked about. The other would be openness to new ideas. The assessment looks at that, and that reflects the conservatism bias we talked about, that tendency to stick with established beliefs. The assessment looks at one other factor that I think you could argue is indirectly related to a bias that we talked about, and that's future time perspective. Does the client think about the future of their business? I mean, to do so, you could argue that they've got to be able to resist that salience bias, that tendency to focus on what's most present and visible for them. The other thing I like about the tool is that it includes a comprehensive guide that has concrete examples with how to talk to clients about these issues.
Yeah, that engagement readiness assessment is great work, and I really do thank you so much for collaborating with me on that, Larry. So let's see if we have questions from our audience. The Q&A icon is lit up over here, so let's see what we have. We have a question here saying, how do you reconcile the heuristic issue with the concepts presented in Blink? You know what? I don't know what Blink is. Do you know what Blink is?
I read it years ago. I
Okay.
believe but I'm not wholly familiar with it. I think one thing that I can point out, and I think this might be what the audience member is getting at, and that is that not all heuristics are bad. There is some research that suggests that using a heuristic in situations where we are very familiar with all the variables involved and all the statistics involved and the odds of things happening and so forth, when the numbers are pretty clear cut, using a heuristic may not be a terrible thing. But the flip side is in other situations where there's a there's a lot of the gray areas are very big, and there's a lot of uncertainty statistically about what could be happening. Using heuristics can cause us to make some mistakes. I'm thinking that might be what the person was asking about.
Okay. I hope so. Let's see if there's any other questions here. Looks like there are no other questions right now, so maybe they'll come up in a moment. But do you have any just kind of closing remarks that you might want to share, Larry?
Sure, Tom. Well, number one, of course, thanks for inviting me, and I appreciate those in the audience sharing their time with us too. Let me close with something from my days as an executive coach. I almost always would employ a personality assessment or more than one, to help a coaching candidate understand how their personality was working for them on the job and how it might cause them to shoot themselves in the foot. And I frequently got pushback from candidates saying, hey, I already know everything about my personality. Why do I need to do those assessments? And I counter that by saying, well, my assessments are a little bit different. And if an instrument only tells us what we already know about ourselves, then it's not very valuable, is it? But wouldn't it be worthwhile to identify strengths and blind spots that aren't obvious and then work together to capitalize on that information? Similarly, Tom, I think there may be some EvaluSys users on the call today too who've encountered that kind of resistance when they've suggested using that diagnostic tool. A business owner may not be, they might be reluctant to employ a new instrument, or they may not want to discover that there's something amiss in their operations. Those same sorts of biases we've talked about. I think if I was in that situation, I'd probably lean into that notion of minimizing loss. You could emphasize that EvaluSys, well, it identifies deficits that could potentially endanger their profitability.
Absolutely.
Let me share one more slide here. For those in the audience who want to learn more about cognitive bias, I highly recommend these two websites. The Behavioral Economics Guide has been published annually since 2014, and you can download each year for free at behavioraleconomics.com. I also recommend that you check out Decision Lab at decisionlab.com. They've got dozens of really solid white papers, very easy to read, that explore sort of the intersection between behavioral science and individual behavior. And then finally, if this is your typical client, I sincerely hope that today was helpful.
Larry, thanks so much for your time today. And for our audience members on today's webcast, I'm going to work with Larry to kind of summarize some of the information you've heard today with a specific focus on the strategies to help the clients confront issues within their business. And we'll get that out to you via email. There was a question that just came in. Will you share a video recording so I can watch it again? The answer to that is yes. I think what you'll find is this session is going to show up in the EvaluSys YouTube channel. And I will make sure to share that information with everyone who's registered on the call today. So once again, thanks so much, Larry. You're up in Chicago. Keep warm. I know it's a cold time of the year right now, but I see you're bundled up in a nice warm sweater. And
yeah.
So again, thanks all of you for being in attendance today, and have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week.